Hello, I would like to welcome you on behalf of the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation for this webinar on China's and Russia's role on the Nordic countries or Northern Europe. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of our Office for the Nordic Countries. My name is Gabriele Baumann and I have been representing KAS in Stockholm for the last 7 months. Together with the Danish Institute of International Studies, we decided to carry on with our discussions using the web format until we have a possibility to meet in person again. I would therefore like to thank Kristian Fischer, the director of the Danish Institute of International Studies, for being ready to have expert talks under these circumstances. Today, our speakers come from Denmark, Sweden, and Estonia. The topic on our common agenda is the demanding strategic role of both China and Russia, two global players which are treated by the EU as strategic rivals on one hand. On the other hand, we understand that we need to work with them to tackle many global challenges. The question from my German perspective would also be, how can we secure our value and rules-based international order? Are there any of our partners maybe already facing financial and economic pressure as a result of the dependence on China? And regarding Russia, the EU and Russia had been building a strategic partnership before the annexation of Crimea in March 2014 and the Russian military intervention into Ukraine in August 2014. These violations of international law by Russia were aligned with building up a new pro-Russian entity in eastern Ukraine and destabilizing Ukraine until now. Tensions between the EU and Russia have been growing since then, and sanctions are still in force. I personally have been following this process closely as I've been working for the foundation in Ukraine between 2012 and 2019, and before that in the early 2000s in Russia, St. Petersburg. Disinformation campaigns have been spreading all over since then. But now I would like to take the opportunity to give the floor to our distinguished experts, including Kristian Fischer as a moderator. We have an audience of 45 participants who have registered, and I would like to encourage you, the audience, to ask questions to our speakers. That is possible through the Q&A button. The questions you mark with a like will reach a priority also for being answered. So please also write your name together with a question in the chat. I also would like to inform you that this discussion will be recorded and will be later be available online. And now I would like to wish us all an interesting discussion. Thank you, and Kristian, please take over.
Thank you very much, Gabrielle, and good afternoon to everybody. It is really an event that we have been looking forward to at DIIS, to do this together with the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung. We believe that there has been a lot of developments in the Baltic Sea region and in Northern Europe. We've seen great power politics to a different degree than we've seen before, and we've seen two major powers' involvement in the region change. So now we are focusing on that, and we have for that three great speakers with us today, and I will introduce them all now rather than take up time in between the interventions. The first speaker this afternoon will be Martin Kragh from Udenrigspolitisk Institute in Stockholm. Martin will speak on Russia and the Nordic in the wider Baltic Sea perspective. He will focus on foreign relations, on similarities and on differences among the Nordic countries vis-a-vis Russia, and he will have a particular focus on security, economics, and diplomacy. Martin will then hand over to senior researcher Luke Patey from DIIS. Luke has spent a good great deal of his modern professional life on the study of China's global rise. And in his presentation today, he will focus on Denmark's and Sweden's ties with China in recent years, and China's influence campaigns, trade and investment, and geostrategic aims in the Arctic and the new challenges that this poses to the Scandinavian countries. After Luke, we will have Frank Jüris. He is a research fellow at the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute, the ICDS. His research focus is on China's domestic and foreign policy, EU-China relations, China's relations with the Central and Eastern European countries, and also interesting China-Russia relations. The topic for his presentation is handing over EU strategic infrastructure to China, the Talsinki tunnel. Mark that, it's going to be interesting for you. The Talsinki tunnel and the Arctic Connect. And he will discuss Chinese infrastructure projects, which in addition to economic aims, also carry geopolitical outcomes in a strategically important Arctic region. So we have, ladies and gentlemen, we have a very interesting afternoon cocktail for you. I'm sure that we'll have quite a bit of new knowledge being presented here today on Russia's and China's engagement in the region. And of course, China and Russia have different objectives and are also using different instruments. Each of the speakers will have 10 minutes for their presentations. I have with me here a red card and a yellow card, and everybody knows the meaning of that. A red card means that you have to finish your sentence. A yellow card means that you have about 1 minute left for your presentation. I hope I will not need those cards, of course. After the presentations, I will first ask a couple of questions to our panelists, and after that, I'll draw questions from the Zoom question and answer function, which I encourage you to use. Be concise, be polite, as Gabriele also said. After the Q&A session, Gabriele will round us off, and then we will finish the webinar. But let us start with your presentation, Martin. We look very much forward to it.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you here online. Russia and the Nordics and the wider Baltic Sea region, it's of course a multifaceted topic. It's also a topic that has quite deep historical linkages, and there's a sort of, which means that in my presentation, I'll discuss some of these sort of deeper links that you see where you have certain continuity in the relationship between the Nordic countries and Russia, but also in relation to what happened since 2014, in particular after the annexation of Crimea, and the overall deterioration in the security climate in Europe, including Northern Europe. From the Russian perspective, the Baltic Sea region is of course important. Historically, Russia only had two warm water ports through which they could navigate. It's the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea. And in the last few decades, the Baltic Sea region had strategic significance from a few perspectives. One is in terms of security. Previously Soviet territory, now Russian territory, is the Kaliningrad region. So Russia is one of the sort of stakeholders in the Baltic Sea region. In terms of energy, the Baltic Sea region is crucial for Russia. Russia exports a large share of its oil through the Baltic Sea, and it also connects Russian natural gas through the pipeline Nord Stream 1, and they are building, although it will slow down, the Nord Stream 2 to Germany. Thirdly, the second largest city in Russia, St. Petersburg, is a Baltic Sea state. So to supply this region, the broader Leningrad region in Russia, the Baltic Sea region is very important for Russia. It's also connected geographically in a way to another region that is crucial, which is the Arctic region. Perhaps the region where we have seen the most dramatic change in the last few years, where the great power competition in our area of the world has been growing. Russia is the largest Arctic state in terms of territory, and the Nordic states, all of them are also Arctic states, including Denmark through the territories of Greenland. Throughout Russian history, Russian leaders always compensated changes in one part of its territory also through reacting in other parts of its near abroad or on its territory. So changes in the Black Sea region, for example, can be felt also in the Baltic Sea. And one thing we have seen, although nobody has been threatening Russia in the Baltic Sea region, also here, there has been an increase in Russian military activity, and Russia even at one time in the region cooperated and had a naval exercise together with China. Western states have also increased military presence, reinforced to some extent with some forces in the Baltic Sea, Baltic states, but also Sweden and Finland for the first time in the last few years started cooperating, although not joining NATO, but cooperating more closely with NATO. The Nordic countries, of course, have a lot of similarities. They are usually considered to be part of a broader sort of historical region or political region in Europe, the Nordic countries. The Baltic states, of course, more and more integrated with the Nordic states. But there are also differences. Everybody who lived and grew up in Sweden, Finland, Norway, or Denmark are acutely aware of the national sensitivities when the countries are compared. Finland, of course, has its own differences in its relationship with Russia. It's a neighboring country, has a long border to Russia, and it has a historical relationship with Russia that is unique among the Nordics because it fought a war with the Soviet Union. It's also an active trading partner. And Russia is also building a nuclear power plant. Although it's a slow process, I mean, this shows that Russia is actually the only country of the Nordics where Russia has some economic presence of significance. It's in Finland. Sweden, on the other hand, was for a number of years the largest foreign direct investor in Russia. Now, since 2012, already when Putin returned to power, the optimism was decreased among Swedish investors, but Swedish companies, to a large extent, have a quite extensive presence in the Russian economy. IKEA, Ericsson, Volvo, Scania, etc. All the sort of large industrial corporations have a presence in Russia. But apart from these broader sort of historical qualities of the relationship, since 2014, of course, what we have seen is a decline in cooperation, the decline in the overall security climate. I mentioned some of this already. But there are, apart from the military activity where there's been an increase in the exercises, we've also seen outright military threats, civilian vessels that were harassed in the Baltic Sea region by Russian military navy vessels, and also the border disturbances a few years ago when Russian border guards supported migrants or guest workers in Russia to cross the border to Finland and Norway in a way that was intended to create a strong political effect, and it was in fact coordinated by the Russian authorities. And the third thing we have seen in this deterioration is an overall increased rhetoric from Russian diplomats and politicians constantly accusing the Nordic countries of being at the top of the most Russophobic, as they call it, the most Russophobic countries in Europe. This is not necessarily the case, I would argue, but Finland, for example, maintains quite active diplomacy, even though they have joined the sanctions regime against Russia. They haven't cut off diplomatic political ties. They remain quite large in comparison with other Nordic countries and Russia. But in the last few years, although there was no relationship for a few years, since 2 years back or so, also other political leaders and governments in the Nordics started reaching out and having reinstating top-level meetings with Russian counterparts. But of course, it doesn't really make much difference, these bilateral relationship, in the bigger things, because the Nordics are integrated into the multilateral organizations, either of the European Union or NATO, which means that bilateral relationships with Russia cannot really affect any major changes in these countries' policies towards Russia. Kristian, last before I finish, I would just like to show a few pictures that I have for the participants to look at. I'm not sure, is it possible for you to share them with everybody? These graphs and figures that I will show soon, they come from a research project that I had initiated with a colleague, Fredrik Döbel, already 4 years ago. We started collecting data on all Russian public diplomacy towards the wider Baltic Sea region, how they target and communicate on different countries in the region. Can you see it now? Because I don't see it at all. Is there a technical, Kristian, are you able to share it now? Okay.
You have to share your screen. There's a share screen option.
Should
Kristian, should I try to share it, or do you want to?
I think you should do it. There's a at the bottom of the screen. There's a green button where you can share your screen.
Ah, I'm sorry. There was a mistake on my side. I thought we had one person who would do it. Here we go. You will see it.
We're not seeing it yet. Oh, now something is happening. Yes, it's there.
So, apologies for the technical miscommunication. What you have here is all the Sputnik articles from 2016 to 2020, and it's articles that where the topic is somehow related to the countries in the Baltic Sea region, excluding Germany, because there are too many articles about Germany. So this is the Nordic countries plus the Baltic states and Poland. And as you can see, it's an average about 5 to 10 articles per day. So it's a sort of normal fraction if you compare it to all the other countries. So it means that the Nordics and so on, they are in the, of course, they are mentioned in Russian public diplomacy and media, and there are no dramatic changes over time. But when you look a bit more closely, I will now share with you the distribution of the articles. And here you can see some more interesting differences. This is the relative share of all the articles. So the dark red is Sweden. And that means that about 30% of almost a third of all the articles that were published about the Nordic Baltic states were about Sweden. And then on the second most popular topic were the other Nordic countries, Norway, Denmark, Finland, and Poland. And perhaps to a surprise of many, the Baltic states, a bit fewer. Although they are neighbors of Russia, Sweden was a much more popular topic. And this is the English language Sputnik, I should mention. Of course, Russia maintains other means of communication directly towards the Baltic states. But this is the international Sputnik broadcaster. And here, this is the easiest way perhaps to show the topics, which ones are the most relevant for Sputnik. As you can see, it's a lot about Russia. Russia themes dominate. And the second topic is security. And the third topic is, depending on how you break it down, but when you go into, for example, Sweden, it was migration and crime in the last few years. So these are, broadly speaking, how Russia communicates. And with that, I will now complete and finish my presentation, and I'm not sure how I will remove the share screen, but I'm finished, so thank you.
Thank you for that, Martin. I hope that you can undo your screen. I still have it here.
Yeah.
But in the meantime,
There it is.
Luke, I hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Kristian and Gabriele. It's a pleasure to be with you virtually today. So I want to go over 3 interlinked challenges I see Northern Europe's Scandinavian countries, Denmark and Sweden in particular, facing when it comes to relations with China. For over a decade now, of course, as many of us know, China has become a top 10 trading partner and a key investment destination for Northern European countries. And as with other European countries, for Scandinavia, relations with China are absolutely essential in overcoming larger global challenges, whether it's conflict and poverty or pandemics and climate change. But over the same period of time, the last decade, China has really emerged as both an economic competitor and a geopolitical rival for Scandinavia and Europe. Its brand of state capitalism and hardening authoritarian politics at home now plays a much deeper role in the global economy and in international affairs. So I see this posing 3 types of challenges for Scandinavia and Europe in particular, and that's an information challenge, an economic challenge, and a geostrategic one. So whether you're in Copenhagen or Stockholm or other regional capitals, China has often been presented as an economic partner. And I think this perspective is really no longer tenable. This isn't a call for Scandinavia to decouple from China. That's neither helpful or desirable in following that agenda. But I think regional leaders should start thinking more strategically about China as a trade and an investment competitor, and also how the economic relationship between Scandinavian countries and China is overlapping foreign and security policy aims in regional capitals. So I think firstly, China represents an information challenge. As one Nordic diplomat told me a few years ago, China's permanent status in the UN Security Council, its global presence in trade, investment, and in development, give it the power to declare truth. So China is now in a much better position to steer the global narrative around its own development at home, its own system of politics and economics. And we see this clearly during the COVID-19 pandemic. The message that China often gives countries that receive donations of medical assistance from Beijing or purchase medical equipment from Chinese companies is that the Chinese government expects foreign governments to have a fairly unnuanced, acritical position towards its response to the coronavirus outbreak in China. And this sort of exchange of material assistance for agreeing to China's narrative has really marked the entry of China into the public discourse in Scandinavia. So this is particularly noticeable, I think, even before the crisis. And this is noticeable from not necessarily an online presence of China, but more so the way its ambassadors function in Copenhagen and Stockholm. So in Denmark, for example, before the coronavirus forced lockdowns here, the Danish newspaper Jyllands-Posten, as many of you may be aware, published a satirical drawing of the Chinese flag, replacing its stars with the coronavirus symbol. So the embassy here demanded an apology from the newspaper. The newspaper rebuffed that, and the Danish Prime Minister came out and underlined the fact that there was freedom of speech in Denmark, and also freedom of speech for the Chinese embassy to voice their displeasure. But this controversy around the flag was really building on other disputes that the Chinese embassy and the ambassador have brought up in recent years. Since the ambassador arrived here, he's been writing op-eds in Danish newspapers. He's been doing television interviews, and very much a different type of diplomatic behavior from China that Denmark experienced before, from what Denmark experienced before. I think those of you familiar with Sweden will know that the Chinese ambassador there is even more active and forthright. Relations between the countries have soured quite significantly since the Swedish citizen Gui Minhai was arrested by Chinese authorities in 2015. And the ambassador has threatened economic consequences and countermeasures towards Sweden when he's faced critical comments from Swedish officials, journalists, and academics. His most infamous line, you might remember last November, was that China treats its friends with fine wine, but for its enemies, it has shotguns. So we see that Chinese ambassadors in Scandinavia are becoming much more active in the public sphere. This is completely allowed in a free and open society, and it's by no means unique. The outgoing American ambassador in Germany has also been particularly outspoken there. But the challenge, I think, for both Denmark and Sweden is ensuring that it upholds its political values in the face of China's new engagement in the public sphere. And there have been setbacks, of course. In Denmark, we are still watching this Tibet Commission that is investigating how constitutional rights of protesters were violated during Hu Jintao's 2012 visit. In Sweden, there's a Swedish ambassador that's currently under investigation for arranging a private meeting to try to settle this Gui Minhai case last year. So we see that there's still pressure from China's influence campaigns. Now, a lot of that pressure is built up around the idea that there is an economic dependency on China in Scandinavia and broadly in Europe. And that really represents the economic challenge when dealing with China. So first, I think we often exaggerate that economic dependency on China. There's this assumption that because China is the second largest world economy, that because it's the world's largest trader and a major investor, that therefore there is some inherent economic dependency that Scandinavia has on China. This, however, is a myth, and it's often propagated by major corporations and individuals who are deeply invested in China. The reality is China is a large market, but it's still a highly restrictive one, and access to that market is what we need to be exploring, and how access to that market impacts our economies as a whole and not individual corporations. Just a quick example, China is a top 10 trading partner, definitely for Denmark and Sweden, but for those countries, it represents 6% and 5% of total trade, respectively. EU members represent over half of the trade for Denmark and Sweden. Their EU members are more important investment partners and are more important in global supply chains for Denmark and Sweden as well. So I think the second thing we need to acknowledge is that China is becoming a competitor for some of the region's largest corporations. Whether you're Maersk and you're looking at China Costco, the major Chinese shipping company, you see a new competitor not only in China, but around the world. Or if you're Ericsson or Nokia in Finland, you see Huawei as the big telecommunications competitor. So not only is China, I think we have a misconstrued view of our economic relationship with China, but we also see rising Chinese competition at the global level. So finally, the geostrategic challenge that Scandinavia faces with China is recognizing that economic policy is increasingly overlapping with foreign and security policy. This is, I think, partly the consequence of US-China competition. And here we see Denmark and Sweden reacting with new investigations, new legislation, and possibly new laws into investment screening and tightening foreign takeovers coming from China and elsewhere. The Prime Minister here, Mette Frederiksen, recently pointed out in an interview that the corona crisis underlines the need for Denmark to control its critical infrastructure. She's also indicated that 5G telecommunications in Denmark, in the Danish kingdom, including Greenland and Faroe Islands, are a security policy, not a commercial one. And that Denmark will only work with reliable and trustworthy partners, that being seen as pretty much a signal to Huawei that it will not be participating. Sweden is also conducting a national security review of its critical infrastructure. The Arctic, of course, is playing a big role in the geostrategic area of Northern Europe. And there we see the US in particular applying pressure on Denmark to halt infrastructure development projects that China wants to be involved in Greenland. And I think these decisions and those on Huawei and 5G are often attributed to foreign policy demands coming from Washington and Denmark responding to those demands. But I'm also old enough to remember when Danish diplomats were urging the Obama administration to pay more attention to the Arctic. I also can remember when Denmark, Sweden, and other European countries signed up to the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank against the wishes of the Obama administration. So my final point is that we need, for the geostrategic challenge, Scandinavian countries need to try to step away from this false binary that we are making choices between American and Chinese interests, and to sort of reinforce our own interests, our own economic objectives, and own political values when taking those foreign policy decisions. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Luke. And now we move on to Frank. Frank, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for very interesting talks. I will use the PowerPoint to illustrate my talk. Can everybody see my presentation? Okay, excellent. I will first talk about Belt and Road Initiative in general, and one part of it, the Digital Silk Road. Then I will introduce two infrastructure projects connecting Europe or Northern Europe with Asia via the Northern Sea route. And in the end, I will also mention the security implications involved in these two infrastructure projects. So first of all, the Belt and Road Initiative, first introduced in 2013, was a Chinese grand strategy to deal or to improve international trade through investments in the infrastructure. And it also has a strategic rationale behind it. It's also about creating alternative trade routes. Because by 2008, Chinese international trade up to 85% dependent on international maritime sea routes. So China saw it as a vulnerability and one of the reasons behind the Belt and Road Initiative. In 2015, first time Digital Silk Road was introduced. It today has different connotations to it, but mainly it can be described by four different components. One of it is being infrastructure that I will also discuss today in detail. In infrastructure, I mainly mean 5G technology, digital or data undersea data cables that are actually the backbone of today's internet system. I'll also talk about, I won't talk about, but I just mentioned technology-wise, the Digital Silk Road strives to improve Chinese capabilities in areas like AI, quantum computing, and of course, one big part of it is also e-commerce, and especially Chinese online payment systems that China wants to internationalize its currency. And of course, internet governance practices that China also wants to promote worldwide, and not even that far from Europe. We have heard cases of some of the surveillance systems installed in Serbia. How these Belt and Road initiatives are directly connected with the Nordic Baltic region is that China in 2018 revealed its China's Arctic policy, and it saw cooperation possibilities with Nordic Baltic countries in Arctic research, logistics mainly starting to use the Northern Sea route, build infrastructure to facilitate this new trade route, and of course exploration and exploitation of natural resources that the Arctic region is rich on. So first of all, I will talk about Talsinki tunnel project that I recently have researched. This project is promoted by a Finnish company called Finnish Bay Area Development, and it foresees the construction of undersea tunnel connecting the two capitals of Finland and Estonia, Helsinki and Tallinn. That's why the name Talsinki Tunnel. And the total budget, the planned budget is 15 to 20 billion euros, and it is it's hoped to be finished by 2024. The Finnish Bay Area Development Company has already signed MOUs with Chinese financier by the name Touchdown, and also with Chinese state-owned companies who are supposed to build the tunnel. This project also includes Arctic Railway that is supposed to connect the Kirkenes, where it's planned to be built deep water seaport, connecting Kirkenes in Norway with Finnish city Rovaniemi via railway. So if these all infrastructure projects are one day finalized, then Chinese goods could travel from as far as northern Norway down to Warsaw and Berlin via interlinked railway connections. So for China, it is clearly the win-win situation, because Chinese, very likely the Chinese state-owned banks would be the financiers of these projects. They will provide the loans, and also Chinese companies, construction companies, state-owned construction companies will be building it. In addition, it would give China a political leverage for decades, because infrastructure projects, they tend to last for a long time. It is not reasonable to build another tunnel or another railway. So China would be able to use its investments, use its leverage to influence the domestic politics that look very well brought up. And in 2019, China's defense white paper also pointed out that in order to keep on the development track that China is aiming for, it has to develop, besides alternative sea routes, also supply points to service its military power projections abroad. So China is looking forward to building either dual-use dual-use ports to service its military ships, to have blue water capability, or build navy ports. One prime example of it is in Djibouti. So now to the second infrastructure project connecting the Arctic with Nordic Baltic region and Asia. Arctic Connect is a Finnish project that is planned to connect Europe with Russia and Asia by undersea data cable network. And in 2016, the company who's building it, Finnish state-owned company Cinia, already chose Huawei Marine's platform for this project. And then just recently, Huawei Marine's stake or Huawei Marine's majority stake was sold to a Chinese company by the name Hengtong Optic Electric. Hengtong Optic Electric has previously developed, together with Dongji University, undersea observation networks. These are dual-use platforms that can be used for underwater surveillance, for environmental reasons or scientific reasons, but they also enable system to be used also for military purposes. For instance, using the acoustic sensing technology for detecting submarine movement. And if this undersea observation network is built in the Arctic, in a strategically important region, this of course changes the whole power play in the Arctic region. So namely, by building this Arctic Connect data cable or underwater surveillance system, two things in one, China would improve its data collection capabilities because vast amounts of data will travel between Europe, Russia, and China. And it would also increase China's data protection capabilities because, to mention data collection capabilities, because according to the 2017 Chinese defense, China's security law, all Chinese companies, enterprises, or any institutions are obliged to collaborate with the security forces of or intelligence forces of China. So of course, if the platform is provided by Huawei Marine or the Hengtong Optic Electric, then this would enable China to collect data more easily. And in addition, because China's Russians' data will no longer travel to foreignly owned data cables, it would also enable China to protect its data from outside interference. And the most threatening, in my eyes, or strategically most important, is the undersea surveillance capabilities that already these data cables itself can be used by using the DIIS disruptive acoustic sensing technology. It will enable. It was actually developed by the British company Genetic in 2006, namely for the purpose of detecting underwater or submarine activity. So if it would be even, added with the different sensors and underwater drones, patrolling the Arctic Sea and protecting the data cable from outside interference, this would give China a strategic advantage in Arctic Sea or along the Northern Sea route. Why is the Arctic region important? This is of course due to nuclear deterrence and second strike capabilities. China sees Arctic or northern flank as its vulnerable flank, and it would definitely like to increase its capability either by acoustic sensing or otherwise. So in conclusion, Chinese infrastructure projects carry, besides economic aims, also geopolitical outcomes, which should not be disregarded in the pursuit of EU strategic autonomy. But if you like what I talked and would like to find out more information about it, please check out my two recent research projects that I've written for Synopsis and Estonian Foreign Policy Institute. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much indeed, Frank, for this, and thank you to all three speakers, not only for a lot of very useful information, but also for their incredible discipline. It's not very often that you get such a short time to present complicated issues, and speakers all are so disciplined as you are. Thank you for that. I think there was really a lot of good points. If I just mention some of the ones that I take with me, I thought that your chart, Martin, on how high the Baltic Sea region is on the Russian media agenda is interesting. I've heard also Russians being saying in seminars that the Baltic Sea region is not that high on the agenda. On the national agenda of Russia. Of course, it is important, but there are so many other foreign policy issues there. I think it was also interesting to see the differences between the states in the region. Luke, from you, I really took the very exact figures you gave on the size of trade between Sweden and Denmark, 5-6% trade of our total trade with China, and that, as you said, that it gives us much more leverage. I think your point about that China, with its increasing economic strength, also is being able to steer the global narrative was very interesting indeed. And Frank, your mentioning of the two projects, the polar dimension of Belt and Road Initiative and the Talsinki tunnel, I think is very new to many people. I think this is certainly something we should keep an eye on. I hope that somebody will ask you more into questions about who owns this if the projects go through. How is it connected with the Baltic railway line? What is Russia's attitude to it, and stuff like that? But let us come back to that. One thing, and also you're mentioning, Frank, of the Arctic Connect. I had not heard about that, and I think that is very interesting indeed, and something that we should very much keep an eye on. Undersea surveillance capabilities is very interesting indeed. I have one general question for you, and that is that if we look at the Baltic Sea region and Northern Europe, we see a lot of different cooperation for some with Russia, some without, or most without Russia. We have Nordic cooperation in the so-called NORDEFCO in defense sphere. We have Nordic Council, we have Nordic Council of Ministers, we have Nordic Baltic cooperation, we have Nordic Baltic and US cooperation, and we have of course EU, and we have NATO, and we have Northern Group. A lot of different multilateral cooperation for. But when we look at the challenges that we see in these two great powers' interest in the region, are we using these multilateral fora in the way that we could use them? And the reason why I'm asking this is that we all come, all us who are on the podium, so to speak, today, we are all coming from small countries. I'd say, Luke, you come from Canada. I don't call that a small country, but you live in Denmark and have lived there for a long time. Are we good enough? Are we doing well enough in order to collect the broader picture of the great power involvement in our region and how it is changing? And are we doing well enough when it comes to perhaps formulating common positions? We saw some dramatic changes in the aftermath of the invasion of Crimea. We saw some strong Nordic statements coming out from defense ministers and so forth. But I ask you the broad question, whether you have seen a change in some of these multilateral fora in recent years, and whether you see that there is a possibility to use some of these multilateral fora more in the future. Who wants to go first?
Well, since I commenced among the panelists, I could say a few words. You know, most of these regional organizations that you mentioned, they were designed explicitly to be about all sorts of cooperation, but not geopolitical questions. Security was deliberately left out as a topic, for example, in the Arctic, Regional Arctic Council, for example. And I think that's a good thing, because it means that these organizations have a capacity to continue working, even when you have geopolitical confrontation or conflict with countries such as Russia, and because there are other issues on environment and natural resources and so on, where cooperation is still helpful for all parties. And I think they could be even more useful as we move forward, if there would be in the future a political change in Russia, of course, these organizations could be even more activated. But my opinion is that they should be treated for, and they should be used in the way they were originally designed, which is regional cooperation, environment, local populations, and so on and so forth. And for the NATO members in the Nordic Baltic Sea region, I think security issues are mostly dealt with through NATO or through the EU for all of the countries.
I can continue. I think I'll discuss maybe the international level. I mean, the major issue I think right now that Europe has with China economically could largely be settled in reform and sort of modernization of the World Trade Organization, and countries, Japan, Canada, Brazil, and the EU, of course, have sort of joint sort of groups to advance some of this reform. But of course, the United States under President Trump has not been a helping hand in keeping these multilateral institutions like the WTO thriving and adapting. More so the opposite, that the Trump administration has quite a disdain for multilateralism, a disdain for international cooperation, and particularly the functions of the World Trade Organization. So this really handicaps, I think, this collective response on trade and investment that could very much be there towards China should the U.S. sort of change that perspective on the World Trade Organization, or if China, from its side, sees the sort of market distortions that its large levels of state subsidies at home create for other economies around the world. I think collective action between small states, whether in Scandinavia, North America, or Southeast Asia, has a lot of traction that is unexplored when dealing with China. And I think we saw this most recently in the World Health Organization at the World Health Assembly, where Australia really stuck its neck out to a degree and called on countries to support a resolution to investigate the World Health Organization's response to the COVID-19 pandemic, which of course initially China responded quite harshly to, placing even trade restrictions on Australian beef and barley. But we saw 122 countries support that resolution in the end, and not just Western countries. India, Indonesia, Japan, 54 African countries got behind the resolution in an effort to ultimately improve how the WHO will respond to pandemics in the future. So I think, Kristian, to your question, I think there's a lot of room to explore in how small states can work together. But they firstly, I think, need to stop thinking that the loss of Australian beef to China is somehow going to be an advantage for another beef producer. Because in the long run, this will really allow, if there isn't a collective response, big powers, not only China but also the United States, can really play by whatever rules they like. So this sort of collectivity is really necessary.
Thank you for that, Luke. Frank, would you like to comment? Otherwise, I have two questions for you from the chat, or from the Q&A, sorry. Frank?
Yes, I would like to first comment the unity question. I think Luke very well pointed out that we tend to overemphasize Chinese impact or economic impact towards Europe or towards our small member states, because the most important economic partner for us still is are inside the European Union, And if we could act more together, then we could also pressure China, because China isn't that important market to us, but we, European Union in totality, is a very important partner for China. It's like one of its target markets. So I think there should be more collaboration, and we shouldn't downsize our own importance or the importance of the European market. But the Chinese tactics so far has been, bilateral bullying. Be it Norway, when Norway gave the peace prize to Liu Xiaobo, and the salmon export to China was hit with sanctions. In Estonia, Estonian leaders unofficially met with Dalai Lama. After that, Estonian dairy products couldn't enter the Chinese market. So there are several occasions when China has been using its economic might against inferior partners. But we should think about it. How can we stand our ground and in a way also hold true to our values?
Thank you for that, Frank. I have two questions for you here. I'll read them up because maybe not everyone can read the Q&A. The first one, it comes from Carl-Henrik Pallo. The first one reads, what cultural export activities is China undertaking in Estonia? And also ask, and other Baltic countries, but I think we should focus on Estonia, Frank. How much do we know about the dealings of the Confucius Institute and the Chinese New Year celebrations, for example? And the second question, are there any other planned infrastructure projects that Chinese businesses or banks have shown interest in? For example, a railway route through Kazakhstan, Russia, Estonia to the Nordics has also been discussed. Frank?
Thank you, Mr. Pallo, for interesting questions. I would like to first point out that there has been, of course, cultural export activities by the Chinese. We have already for, I think, 10 years now, I've had the Chinese New Year celebrations in Tallinn, in the capital of Estonia. So I think the citizens would be very saddened when one day the Chinese New Year didn't take place anymore. It has become like a local tradition already. So I think definitely Chinese Embassy and Confucius Institute have been promoting cultural activities and cultural exchanges between Estonia and China. And it's one way to learn more about other culture. But of course, if you think about the fact that Chinese language in Estonia, especially in Tallinn University, is taught mainly, or not mainly, only by Confucius Institute, then of course this, set some restrictions what you can and cannot speak in your language classes. But I think Tallinn University so far has done a very good job in dividing the political and political sphere of the discussions and mainly language learning and culture. So I wouldn't overemphasize the fact that Confucius Institutes are teaching Chinese in Estonia, because one big concern is, of course, academic funding, and this costs money. This costs a lot of money, and unfortunately, academic funding isn't in the best condition in Estonia, and this is one of the reasons why Confucius Institute we are using Confucius Institute to learn. And the question about infrastructure projects, yes, it was actually recently announced by the Estonian Ministry of Economics that they are exploring the possibilities of using this east-west land-based corridor that the trains or the shipments or cargo would travel from China through Kazakhstan and Russia to Estonia, where it would be shipped to Sweden. So a big question mark for me is that in Finland there are already two destinations, Vuosaari and Kouvola, that are servicing these trains. So this would also give China a very good opportunity to play each member states against each other, and it would give not only China the possibility to intervene in our logistic industry, but also Russia. As we know, after the bronze soldier incident in 2007, if I'm not mistaken. Then Russian cargo was transferred away from Estonia. This impacted a lot. So now we are trying to give our our logistics sector into the hands of two authoritarian governments that use their political, connections for that are using their economic connection for the political aim. So I think this should be seriously considered. Also, the security threats involved. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Frank. And to follow on from that, and I'll just pose a question to Luke. Maybe you want to say something about investments in Europe from China, and also the other way around. I think it's something that you write about in your upcoming book. But in the meantime, while you think, maybe Frank, you can say something about Russian reactions to the Talsinki tunnel project. The floor is yours, Frank.
Yes, Russian reaction. To be honest, when I was searching this Talsinki tunnel project, I can relate to Martin's research that one of the first news that came from the new signing of MOUs or new deals connecting the Talsinki tunnel project actually came from Russian Sputnik, but the Chinese language Russian Sputnik. So I was very surprised by the fact that the Sputnik in Chinese is so aware of these developments there. But I think Russia, if I may a little bit divert, Russia has been interested in co-developing its Arctic region, not only with China, but also with other East and Southeast Asian partners. I think might be Russia's strategy, not to put all the eggs in one basket and diversify the risks. So this, these are the main, I think, this kind of trends in the Arctic region. Because, for instance, Yamal LNG plant, also Japanese companies participating in Yamal 2, and in Yamal 1, it's also a French company, Total, and the big oil development or oil industry developments in the Arctic. There are also Indian companies on board. So I think this is one of Russia's way to diversify.
I can.
Thank you. And Luke, yeah.
Sure. I mean, first of all, right now in Europe, anyone reading economic or financial news or even political news will have come across an article or two about concern in the European Union over Chinese takeovers of European corporations. That concern coming from the depressed economic conditions in Europe and therefore the lower stock prices of many European companies, making them targets for acquisition. A concern that is reinforced by the experience from the last global financial crisis, when Chinese and other non-European companies sort of scooped up a lot of European firms on the cheap, as it's said, because of the poor economic conditions in general, rather than necessarily the negative or poor performance of the company in particular. So that concern is there again today. We're still seeing how it's going to shape out. The Swedish airline company Norwegian, recently a stake in it was purchased by a Chinese buyer. But we still haven't seen a large amount of Chinese acquisitions as of yet. I mean, and all that being said, we shouldn't, first of all, exaggerate the level of Chinese investment in Europe. It has dropped quite significantly since 2016, when it reached a high level, and that's largely because of capital controls on the Chinese side. But even at smaller levels, some research studies have found that there is a very targeted approach of Chinese investment in Europe. And so China has this Made in China 2025 strategy to lead in high-tech manufacturing in the global economy. And for instance, one Swedish study found that around half of the investments made in Sweden in recent years have been within those sectors. So even small investments in sort of high-tech, small or medium-sized corporations in Europe, which from China can be very lucrative to the private owner or to the company in that China might pay even above the share price. But that again will lead to a transfer of technology to the Chinese corporation, and therefore in the long run see sort of a diminished competitive position from the European standpoint. And just briefly, one quick example, if you remember from the last global financial crisis, the Chinese corporation Geely, a private automaker, bought Sweden's Volvo cars from Ford Motors in the US because of the global financial crisis. They bought it at a very low price. And since then, they've certainly stabilized Volvo. Volvo is doing quite well in the global car industry. But Geely, the Chinese corporation, has been able to take on that technology, that expertise that Volvo has developed for over 100 years, and really now is the fourth largest seller of automobiles in China itself, and rising also on the global scene. And I think, in another 5 to 10 years, this company will be not only a competitor to Volkswagen, BMW, and Daimler in China, but also globally. So these acquisitions, which are often completely natural, can have long-term competitive consequences for European corporations.
Thank you, Luke. There's another question, but that is on China. I'll park it for a moment. I'll come back to it. But I also wanted to bring in Martin. Martin, on Russia. A fairly broad question to you. We often talk about the need to engage Russia in a positive and constructive political dialogue, and has not been easy, especially because of the events in Ukraine, but certainly also Syria and so forth. And we've had some difficult dialogue on Nord Stream, which I think that many have found pretty cumbersome and pretty resource demanding. And defense and security, I mean, there's not much hope for a very constructive dialogue on those issues, as I see. But where do you see, when you put on sort of the constructive glasses, where do you see that there could be some possibilities in the region? Environment, health, in the aftermath of the COVID crisis, safety at sea, tourism, other infrastructure developments, and do you see that we may be able to do some of that in a multilateral forum and some of that in more bilateral relations? Would be fantastic to have a remark or two on that.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Thanks. Well, most of those linkages to Russia, by tradition, they are bilateral. So you referred to a few areas where Nordic countries were involved, for example, in through development projects. Now, as Russian GDP per capita went up in the last 20 years now, it's declining for a number of years now, slightly in dollar terms, but overall Russia moved up into the slightly higher income bracket, which means that foreign aid was to some extent diminished for Russia. That's usually earmarked for countries that are considered to be more poor. But I think the biggest driver for integration since 1991 was economic investments and trade. Now, what happened was not related so much to the military conflict. It was related to the changing political climate in Russia. I referred earlier to the fact that Sweden was by tradition a large foreign investor in Russia. That started to decline already in 2012 when Medvedev announced that he would not run for president, but rather that Putin should return. This was a strong negative signal to the investor community in the West that there would be no reforms, there is not going to be anti-corruption work taken seriously. There have been a few reforms, but overall they haven't helped. And now with the decline in oil prices, with the sanctions against Russia, the economic cooperation is not going to be enhanced. As far as other areas of cooperation are concerned, the Nordic countries are much more involved and engaged in Russia with Russians, people-to-people diplomacy than what is typically recognized, also by Russian authorities, I think, when they say that accuse Western states of being negligent of Russian interests. There are a lot of projects, they are ongoing. Our diplomats, our sort of public diplomacy institutes, they are in Russia, they are active, and they are trying to reach out. There could be done, more could be done, but of course the major driver of significant change will have to be come from inside Russia. And I think this points to the larger conundrum that we are faced with. It's not so much a question of multilateral organization versus bilateral relationships or regional cooperation, because at the end of the day, the major change here that affected the relationship in a negative way was Russia's authoritarian turn, especially in the last, more than a decade now. So unless there's a change in this area, I don't think we'll see a change in other areas as well. It should be remembered that when you look at opinion polls, Northern Europeans are very skeptical of Russia. And it's true that the Baltic states in particular consider Russia to be a security threat. But when you ask in more detail, for example, a Swede or a Norwegian, why do you have a negative opinion of Russia? They actually point not to the security threat against their own countries, but they point to the fact that human rights are not being respected by Vladimir Putin. And so this reflects a bigger sort of change or the bigger sort of difference in political culture between the Nordics and Russia, and that cannot be easily influenced from our side. End of message.
Thank you for that. And now we go to a question about the perception of China in the region. David Merkel from Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung is asking, also in the light of the COVID crisis, whether some of you can say something about whether there is a higher level of trust or distrust among the audiences compared to the pre-COVID times. It's probably difficult to say something about that. I have not seen anything so far, but maybe you can say something more in general about the development in the last few years. Luke, perhaps first, and then Frank, if you want to join also.
Yeah, it's early days, and only a few polls have come out yet, and you have to sort of unpack those polls to see really how significant they are. But I think over the years, when I look very broadly at perceptions of China through Pew Research polls and others, there is a growing sort of unfavorability towards China, particularly in Western Europe, particularly in East Asia, and those sort of two regions seem to be most concerned of China. Sweden in particular has risen quite sharply of late due to the sort of the testy relations. Its unfavorability towards China rivals that of Japan and South Korea, to give you sort of the significance of that. And Sweden and Canada share this growing unfavorability towards China because of their diplomatic disputes, I would imagine. And I don't I wouldn't be surprised if Australia grew in that sort of viewpoint of late because of the economic restrictions that China's currently placing on the Australian goods. The other point I'll say before passing to Frank is that when we do see these polls, I think we need to take them also into the regional context or the national context. So we have seen some pretty significant polls from Italy that show that Italians are becoming more favorable towards China than even Germany, France, the US. So we see this change of viewpoint from some Italians, and that should be, I think, taken very seriously, because this is a major EU economy, a major EU society, and is becoming, perhaps because of the COVID crisis, becoming more skeptical towards its place in the EU. But that being said, I mean, there are, of course, different political constituencies in every European country, and China and I imagine Russia and certainly the US play this role of advancing, of being sort of used as vehicles to advance some of those political opinions. So favorability towards China used to advance the political positions of Eurosceptics in Italy, or a very negative view towards Donald Trump in Germany is also a very popular political position that some parties and officials take on to drive their own political positions at home.
Frank, did you want to come in here also?
Yes. There hasn't been a poll done or survey done after the Corona crisis, but before the Corona crisis this fall, there was a survey that found out that almost 25% of Estonian participants in the survey didn't know to take any stance towards this kind of infrastructure projects, either the 5G or this Talsinki tunnel. And I think this the reason behind it is that the Estonian people and policymakers are not that used to think of China as a potential threat or potential vulnerability to our society. We have been for decades or fixated with Russia, everything connecting Russia. So I think it is slowly starting to change to also see this kind of strategic aims or geopolitical aims of China in involvement in be it Arctic or be it in Nordic Baltic region. So, but I think also that the Corona crisis, one thing that it has done, it is definitely has raised awareness of potential risk involved with China or China's rise. Be it the dependence of medical equipment coming from China. There were talks, about decoupling or building up Europeans' resilience in this medical sphere. So I think, and the big stories about 5G and Huawei, I think this all have helped to raise awareness of, and in a way also see China's rise without any illusions, see it for face value. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank, and for this. And now I move to Erik Thyselius, who has asked a question to Martin. How does the COVID crisis affect Russian activities in the Baltic area, short-term and long-term?
Thank you, Erik. Nice to hear from you here. To be honest, I don't think we can expect a particular reaction from Russia towards our region, our corner of the world. Overall, what happened in the last 6 months was that Russia was subjected to two major blows. The first one was the pandemic, which has affected Russia quite significantly. They are one of the most affected countries in Europe, and they also have a number of high-level political leaders who actually were infected, including the Prime Minister Mishustin and the President of Chechnya, Ramzan Kadyrov. And this means that what we saw in the early stages, maybe in February, early March, when we had the sort of expected Russian troll campaigns and tinfoil hat people and the conspiracy theorists, who were pushing out all of these weird stories where, you know, about that this is a US laboratory originated virus and so on. This very quickly was sort of moved into the periphery of Russian public discourse, and in fact, Russia hasn't really tried in any way to exploit it in this virus in any strong campaign, with a few exceptions where you had the Italian, for example, mission a bit earlier this year. But those were hardly very successful. I think China was the most active and most sort of influential actor internationally, trying to influence and shape the public debate about the virus. The second shock is the oil price decline. In fact, before the pandemic, Russia negotiated with the OPEC to try to, in order to destroy a US shale oil competition, they tried to push the prices downward by increasing their supply of oil. Now, what happened in the last few months was that because transport was there was such a decline in transport, and globally, the demand for oil now is very low, and in fact, prices just collapsed on oil. They are now the lowest historically in the last 20 years. And so the combination here means that Russia has suffered quite badly, and it means that Russia will probably, Russia retains its military presence in Syria, Ukraine, and even increasing it slightly in Libya. But these are very important areas for Russia. These are the sort of strategically prioritized regions. I think our corner of the world won't see any major, I don't expect any major changes. Although anticipations of the future, you should always be careful.
Thank you, Martin. And now to the last question. Fantastic that we managed to answer all questions at this, from the audience. That means that we are doing a very positive, interactive session here. Regarding academic freedom, Karl-Henrik Palo asked about the Czech Republic and Czech Chinese research cooperation and the work by Chinese actors to create a positive image of China through those channels. I can say here, before I give the floor at least to Luke, that we had an approach a couple of years ago where we wanted to be hosting a Chinese Confucius Center at DIIS, and we said that we did consider it with an open mind and looked at the pros and cons, and in the end said no, because we didn't want to have anybody asking us any sort of questions on our academic freedom and our independence. That was very, very important for us, and therefore we decided that we would not have such a Confucius Institute at DIIS. Luke, you want to add to this, or Frank? Luke first.
Sure. Yep. I can talk a little bit about it in general. I think Frank might have a more cellular knowledge about Eastern Europe and its approach. Of course, this is a Confucius Institute and other sort of Chinese cultural and language centers that are connected with the Chinese government have been under the microscope recently in Scandinavia. Sweden has now closed down all of its Confucius Institutes and Confucius classrooms. This wasn't a national agenda by any means. This was really local partners taking that decision, and at the Swedish level. And you know, I guess it dovetails with the more sort of negative relations that the two countries have in general. Sister city agreements have also been canceled. So I think, you know, with the Confucius Institute and other Chinese academic partnerships, I think the original hope was in the West, in the US, Canada, and across Europe. The original hope was that, you know, these would foster closer ties with China, that these institutes would bring us closer together, that they might, you know, drive diplomatic and business and academic, of course, academic opportunities. But often I think they were premised on the idea that Western influence would be heading east to China. And I think we're slowly discovering that the influence also heads the other way. That these institutes, because they are integrated within Western universities, I haven't come across many Confucius institutes, whether in Africa or Latin America or Europe, that are publishing sort of critical, insightful research on China, on relations with China. Of course, I think they host a variety of events. They teach the Chinese language and Chinese culture, but these aren't sort of run-of-the-mill institutes that promote academic critical thought, to put it like that. And I would like to see Western governments capable of making investments in academic institutions to drive forward, homegrown Chinese language capabilities. I don't think, countries like Denmark or Sweden necessarily need the economic support to build up Chinese programs within their high schools, within their universities, to teach Chinese language and Chinese culture, and to drive those positive connections underneath the ideals of a Scandinavian university. So I hope that these closings of Confucius institutes in different parts of Scandinavia, don't feed anti-China sentiment, because I think there's a positive there, and of course Alliance Française and other countries have promotional institutes within Scandinavian borders, and I encourage, I think, China to do that. But I think that the major tension is that these institutes are really integrated within universities, within high schools, and within research institutes, and there you find definitely a value clash that's still ongoing.
If I may add to it, there was actually recently a case in Estonia, in Tartu University, when the university's administration tried to block the publishing of one critical article in regard collaboration between Huawei and Tartu University. It was eventually published, but it was published afterwards when investigative journalists found out about the story and made a newspaper article about it. And of course, after that, the Estonian Academic Oriental Society wrote a joint letter condemning this kind of action by the university's administration, and they saw it, this academic collaboration with Huawei and the case in particular, as a violation of academic freedom of speech, and they were very strong about it. So there is unfortunately already cases, but as I said, I think in other Central and Eastern European countries, one big reason behind this collaboration with Chinese counterparts is related to investments and how to say, poor condition of academic finance.
Thank you very much for this. I think that we have been able to provide a lot of new information and room for reflections for those who participated and viewed this. I can tell you that the audience stayed on all the way to the end. Only a few left early. I think that is a sign that you've been doing a really good job, you speakers. So thanks very much to you, and also to the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung for doing all the practicalities in preparing and implementing this. I hope that you will continue to look for either these webinars or these and the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung webinars. We'll be happy to do so. So I hand over to Gabriele. Thank you to you and to Richard for doing all this. Thank you to our viewers.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much, Kristian, for your excellent moderation, and thank you, the speakers, for your contributions. I think we had a very interesting discussion, and I found it interesting to unite discussion on China and Russia, on these two great powers. And I really like the idea also, Luke, about how to find a collective actions and collective response, at least within Northern Europe, on China, and of course it always used to be and always had to be done on Russia as well. So thank you very much, and I think we will go on with discussions, webinars like this. I think we did not really touch upon the Arctic, so this could be also an interesting topic for one of our next seminars. But let us stick to this, and thank you once again, and hope to see you again soon. Thank you.